Hey, awesome. You can hear me? Okay, sweet. All right, well, I guess I'll get it started for my first debate on call-out. Um, I am on the side that's arguing that the government should subsidize basic hurricane protection products to areas in high risk of hurricanes. A, because it's the job of the government to protect citizens, and B, it's economically viable. Um, First of all, just go over some definitions. The government we're talking about is the U.S. government found in Washington, D.C. Basic hurricane protection, we're talking about economic, physical, and digital consequences that affect the individual, and talking about protection for that individual. And high risk as defined as an area with a high possibility of being hit by a hurricane. So the first kind of point that I have is it's the job of the government to protect citizens. The United States Constitution guarantees the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and the government is elected to help bring this about, and aid is one of the biggest things. For an example, Obama's response to Hurricane Sandy is something that we can draw a precedent from, as opposed to President Bush and Hurricane Katrina, which his response there was to do very little. Obama was very hands-on, direct aid, and very generous at that. And we saw a lot of bounce back from that and a lot of infrastructure rebuilding very fast. And in talking about subsidizing, this is a direct way of targeting the specific area even before the hurricane hits so that the rebound is faster. And just because it's definitely too hard to ask the U.S. government to do something just because they morally should, there's also the economic value that's thrown in. So it's economically viable because giving subsidies is a capitalist venture and therefore more American than any other solution. It also encourages consumer engagement. So people go to purchase things that have subsidies and they buy other things that are in the store. That's a basic sort of idea of sales. And then targeted subsidies are a safeguard against further economic losses. So FEMA already subsidizes for a safe room for storm shelters for people that build shelters that provide near absolute protection from severe wind. And they withstand 250 mile per hour wind gusts. And these kind of building projects that are subsidized help keep keep people safe as well as the things that they own. And I'll have to turn it off or turn it back to you.
Okay, so can you hear me? Awesome. Okay, so I'm arguing against the proposition to offer subsidization through the government for hurricane damage because through the things that I've read and the studies that I read through, it seems that the government, through its bureaucracy, is incapable of answering quickly enough to things such as hurricanes, which are very quick to prop up and very hard to guesstimate when it will happen. FEMA, yes, is one of the groups, but there's also a group called the National Flood Insurance Program. They have paid $5.5 billion to repair and build 30,000 homes, a little over 30,000 homes that repeatedly flood. So there hasn't been any steps to curb this repeated flooding. To just pull up something, 5.1 million properties that are insured under the NFIP, 0.6% make up 9.6% of all damages paid, and that was as of 2015. The problem with these repeat flooded areas is a lot of them, through some of this other statistics that I looked at, they're repeat flooding because they're oceanfront property. It's very expensive, very wealthy type of venture. You wouldn't ask someone that has been smoking for decades to be able to pay the same insurance premiums that someone who has had a healthy lifestyle their entire life. I do believe that the pursuit for life and liberty is a good venture, but as any other venture, it has risks and consequences. to your actions. So the government doesn't have any risks, because the government here, we're saying the government pays and subsidizes for this. Obama was generous. It's the taxpayers that are generous. The government is only able to do these things because the taxpayer gives them the money to go out and do these ventures. And I feel that because the government goes through this bureaucracy, goes through this democracy, they end up with a $24.6 billion in debt. And that happened because they were unable to answer to things like Katrina. I believe that a private market would be more suitable to hand these certain types of disasters, because they're incentivized to answer to these high-risk situations and put people in positions where they don't have to spend more money, because now the consumer does not. And I'll just let the last 5 seconds tick off, pass it on to you.
All right. Fantastic. Great opening statements there. First thing I'm going to address is you're really talking about after the hurricane. You're really talking about after disaster comes through and what's the price of rebuilding there. And what I'm talking about is subsidies before it strikes. So the thing that we're arguing about is the government should subsidize basic hurricane protection products to areas in high risk of hurricanes. High risk of it hasn't happened yet. We want to talk about places where the government can subsidize before it strikes. So the whole speed bureaucracy thing doesn't matter as much. What matters is getting the funding to where it's needed. And it should be the government's job, because the Constitution guarantees the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Basically guarantees a strong and a good livelihood for the citizens. Subsidies should definitely happen on basic products. Again, it spurs the economics, the regional economics. It also is economically viable because it saves money in the end. So it saves money when it comes to this disaster release afterwards, where the government is slow and there has to be private industry that helps to rebuild. In the Canadian city of Windsor, for example, the city there is offering residents an 80 to 100% financial subsidy to install a flood pump in their basements due to increasingly frequent and weather events related to climate change. And what the city council there understands is that when so much infrastructure is lost, damage piles up in the city, and it costs more in the end to rebuild all of this rather than just to subsidize this pump and then have everybody be a lot better in the end themselves as individuals, and that it doesn't pile up. You only have a few individual cases. But with this system, you have it where subsidies are brought in, and this allows for the individuals to have a better result in the end. And you're preventing it before the disaster actually strikes. Pass the mic.
Okay. So I'm also in favor of preventative measures, and currently, after the Katrina floods due to Hurricane Katrina, just to pull up a few things, FEMA offers subsidization to actually, it's a mitigation process where they buy the house from the person that owns it to prevent further flood damages and the costs and the grief to the actual individual. The problem is that the government, for every $100 that they spend to rebuild these houses that have flooded again and again, they're paying $1.72. So obviously the government is not being incentivized to end up bringing these people out of these grievances. They're more incentivized to rebuild the house and allow the person to live there. Keep in mind that in the US, private insurance companies aren't allowed to provide flood insurance. So they have a monopoly on the system. So there's no way for the government to gauge where they're going with their money, how the money should be spent. The government sure isn't spending it to remove grievances as much as pay for $400,000 houses that were destroyed on shore. Your argument about Windsor, Ontario, privatized companies incentivize car insurance, health insurance, based on your risk factor and the things you do to prevent you from going into a higher risk factor. So you have people that, like, let's say, I used to live in Manitoba. One of the things that my family did is we had a sump pump in our basement that actually prevented flooding when a lot of the houses near us, because of backwater push up from sewers, flooded their houses because it's a swamp, it's a floodland. It happens. So this was a privatized company, though. They offered us the incentive and the risk reward for spending our own money, giving us the liberty to decide how our money is spent, how we decide to prevent further damages to our own property, instead of handing it off to the government, which obviously, by the $24.6 billion they're in debt, do not understand how to properly spend that money. And I'll just let this, unless I can pass it on to you. Pass them. There we go.
Thank you. I see where you're coming from. So a few things I'm going to address is you were questioning on kind of how the U.S. government carries out their subsidies. And it's not really a question of how they should be doing it. It's the fact that they should be doing it. Of course, they can maybe do it in a more efficient way. There can be different ways that the government can carry out the different subsidies based on the different regions that they're in, the products that they might need in these different regions. For example, one region might need more pumps, another region might need something like barriers, individual barriers for different types of houses. And then you were saying that the government, that you were using private companies' pumps so that the government was not deciding where the money was going in that regards. So FEMA already has, and the US in general, already has a fund for disaster relief and also for disaster subsidies. And using subsidies before a hurricane strikes is something that it makes it so that after the hurricane happens, you have less of this money going out to rebuild, and more of the infrastructure is set in place for individuals. So it actually goes into this idea of the US idea, American dream, of individual liberty, because they have these subsidies in place for certain products so that people can go out, buy it themselves with their own money, and then save their individual private assets, whether that be their home or different things that they have inside their home. And so it still goes along this idea of individual liberty. And the government is not deciding whether they have to go out and do these things, whether they have to go and buy these things that are subsidized. They are going out and choosing to do so themselves.
Just to clarify, in Manitoba, there is no governmental flood insurance. It's all privatized. So the private company gave us a rebate, subsidy rebate, whatever you want to call it. The private company did so because it helped their bottom line. They're also incentivized for us to be less of a risk because they earn more money that way. This is the reason why I believe that a private company should step in, because they have a bottom line that they have to cover. So they're entirely incentivized to give multiple programs to multiple regions. One of the things I pulled up, and it was very easy, 10 minutes, the flood maps for both Houston, since it's topical, and the Florida area, specifically Tampa. This is one of the larger cities. And they have their 100-year flood map right there for you. All you need is to have Google Maps or ArcGIS, and you can see it for yourself, the areas that are most likely to flood. And in Houston, it's smaller pockets spread out throughout the city and suburban areas, whereas for Tampa, it's a large swath of the area, more than 10 kilometers wide. that is affected by this situation, along with the coasts and everything that it engulfs. The government, if it truly believed in life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, subsidization is another word for the government taking some of someone else's money, giving it to somebody else because they purchased something. That's not a very liberal way to look at things. The generosity confused as taxation is a problem. There is charities. That's charitableness. That is someone voluntarily giving their money so that someone can have a better life. Though there are groups that do this, NGOs. I have no problem with the NGO, but when you're asking people money that they're told they have to give to the government, they should have every right to decide whether or not that goes to an individual who decides to live in an area that has a risk of hurricanes and definitely a susceptible and a consequential free life of living on oceanfront property or living in these cities where it is a danger, because it is viewable. These are people that can avoid this. If they have a good realtor, or if they don't have a realtor, they can do it themselves. This is information that is available.
First of all, I'd like to address the fact that you were saying people were choosing to live in a high-risk area. In some cases, and in many cases, people's livelihoods are based in places like Houston, Texas, or in certain places in Florida. People can't afford to move away because that is where everything is for them. Their job, possibly their family, their housing. They could be low income and be in low income housing or affordable housing. And that's where they are, and that's where they're stuck. When it comes to the issue of taxpayers and sort of where their money goes, the U.S. government collects taxes so that it can benefit the entire population, be used according to how the population trusts them. So when a U.S. government is elected in, or when officials are elected in, people elect them on partially how they're going to use the taxpayers' money. And they know that disaster relief is a part of this, and that's just a part of how the government goes ahead and runs. You want to protect every part of the U.S. continent, and part of that is protection of these certain areas. Subsidies saves the taxpayer in the end. So the job of the government is to find the cheapest way possible to find disaster relief for these places, and also disaster prevention. Part of that prevention is subsidies for the basic protection products, which again allows for individual liberty and saves economic saves money in the end, is financially viable, because what you're doing is you're saving money and you're saving products and you're saving assets, you're saving American assets, so that later on, when the storm is over, a person who has their house protected can go out and help others, can go out and spend money, keep the economy going in these places where the economy is almost non-existent because the place has been wrecked, such as Puerto Rico. So if you have more people spending more money, you're going to stimulate the local economy in that area, and you're going to have it keep going. Another thing is with private companies, they're not as accountable. You've seen schemes all across every field. And when the government is providing these subsidies, it makes the person accountable, because they're buying into that subsidy, they're doing it for them, and they're having these basic protections in place because they've bought it and they've carried it out. I'll pass the mic.
So I kind of felt like this would be one of the arguments to pop up. So it was something that I did a little bit of research on, because I remembered a John Stossel video. He used to be a conservative and then became more libertarian as he had his career in 2020. And one of the videos he did, in fact, was on the National Flood Insurance Program. And one of the things he noticed is his 500,000 K plus house, when the first floor was washed out, it was repaired. And when he lost his house completely the second time, it was repaired, renewed. The problem with this form of subsidization, and it's been shown, is that it benefits those with more money, those who are more well off. The average property value of an average single family home under $250,000 was less than the average sum of damages, because the aggregate assets that they have are all in one place. So they stand to lose more, they stand to have higher damages. It would make more sense that in a privatized situation where they can respond to problems like this, where the bureaucracy does not have the staying power. That's the problem. That's the real problem, is the bureaucracy is too slow, can't answer to these things, whereas a privatized company can. They can pull them out of this situation. And it may not necessarily just be buying out their house. There's motivation to foundations, there's motivation to otherwise help people actually move the physical house to higher ground, higher elevation, because that's the only reason and only way that you can fight a flood. Whereas for the average single family home over $250,000, the average property value was exorbitantly more high than the average sum of damages, because their assets are spread out. They don't have the same issue that the poorer class may have. So it's an issue that, even if we could bring this to subsidization towards electric cars, there were people that were getting motorized electrical golf carts. Who golfs that has less than a $250,000 type house? Not many. That's someone having the $250,000 plus house. They were getting subsidizations from the government that made it so their golf cart was free because it was electrical. If that can't argue that subsidizations are as corrupt as you would say for a privatized company because of schemes, quote unquote, these were politicians doing it themselves. These were rich people using subsidizations because they had the $6,000 to drop on a golf cart to get it for free. 5 of them, one of the politicians got.
So, what you seem to be talking about is disaster relief, which is what happens after a hurricane strikes. And what we want to talk about is subsidies before it strikes. So, talking about subsidizing the basic hurricane protection products. So, the things that you could bring up are things like barriers or pumps, things that are used or put in place before the hurricane strikes. Insurance, yes, is one of them, and then you'll have private insurance that will insure you for these rich people's homes, for these golf carts, the things that you're talking about. That should be private insurance. What I'm talking about is subsidies for the products, things that you can go and buy, physical things, previous to a hurricane striking. And that would be equal for both wealthy and lower income individuals, because it is a single product that both the wealthy and the lower income and the middle one can go in and buy. A thing that could help protect them. Really, it puts them on equal footing. Because when it comes to a hurricane, everyone is on equal footing. A hurricane is going to come in, it's natural. It's a natural disaster. It doesn't care whether you're rich or poor. It's going to come in and wreck whatever it's in its way anyways. So things like these protections rooms, these things like barriers that could be individual barriers that can be purchased, having subsidies for these types of products in the hurricane areas is preparing or is recognizing that there's an issue in this certain area and preparing for it. It's like saying that, oh, you should wear dress shoes running in the mud. No, you should wear boots running in the mud. It's preparing for the right type of thing in the right certain area. In a desert in California, they're going to prepare for water droughts. In places in the north, they're going to prepare for for longer winters and having winter tires and whatnot. It's about being prepared for the right area. And having these subsidies for these products before the hurricane strikes is being prepared in these high-risk areas.
So I just want to clarify again that when I say those $6,000 golf carts, they were subsidized by the government due to the green energy movement. So these politicians had the $6,000 lying around to buy one and two, three, four, five, and they spent this money, and then the government subsidized the entirety of the golf cart. So they got a golf cart for free. Not a lot of poor people have $6,000 that they can just throw on a golf cart or have a reason to throw $6,000 on a golf cart. That's subsidization by the government. That's corruption by the government. Those were free carts that rich people were able to get for free. Subsidizations work more towards the people that can afford the high initial cost of these things. You explain these barriers as if they're going to cost like $100. That's the problem. I imagine you. What I'll do is I'll pass it on to you. I'll ask you, did you do any research into the pricing for these barriers? And if you have, I would like to hear some numbers about those, because I haven't seen any of that.
Yeah, no. So great question. I did look into it, and there's different types of barriers that you can buy. There's different things like sandbags, and you can also buy like just construction barriers. Those are around 180, and the sandbags are a lot less expensive. So you can get those for 25 to 50 each. And what you do is you can throw those in front of your house, and you can lose a lot of the flooding sort of that comes in. And also with the pump, you can prevent some of that. So having subsidies on these types of products helps for the future. I'll pass it back because that's what you wanted.
Just a I was pointing at my ear. I don't know if you're watching the live feed, but I didn't get to hear any of your last closing statements. But unfortunately, I wanted to ask if you knew, like for an individual household, because 20 to 50 sandbags each, depending on how high the barrier has to be and how much square footage you're crossing over, what would be the average cost for a household? I was going to ask if you knew. Can you like five it out with your hand or anything? Do you know the? And then just so like go like 1000 for 1,000 or whatever. But anyways, so you can just type it down at the end of this video. But the premise, and I just want to use the last minute I have to cut down, is my issue with the government throwing subsidizations is that one, usually the people that benefit from this, again, tend to be the more wealthy, the more people with assets to burn and to be able to do this. This is the reason why people will build these houses on these ocean fronts and use this heavily subsidized national flood insurance program to basically pave the way for them to live like that without any consequence. In the end, the government removes any incentive for people to do real costs to benefit analysis, while insurance does. That's real life and liberty, the actual pursuit of happiness, being able to do life yourself without the government telling you how and when and where your money will go. real life and liberty ends where your wallet starts. So from here, unfortunately, I didn't get to hear your last statements, but I'll watch it after the recording.